There are 6 determinants or factors that change demand. So what we're talking about here is if we draw our demand curve, we're talking about a change in the relationship between price and quantity. So a change in these determinants causes us to be willing and able to consume, to buy more at every price. That's an increase in demand. Or it may cause us to be willing and able to buy or consume, less willing and able to consume at every price. So a shift to the left, a decrease in demand. So price is not a determinant of demand. If you change the price, it changes quantity demanded. It's already represented on the demand curve because the demand curve shows this relationship between price and quantity demanded. The law of demand says the price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. So what happens when we change things that are not the price of the good? What happens when we start to change quality and the number of buyers and people's income? This is where we start to shift the demand curve to the right or the left, and we're changing that overall relationship between price and the amount consumers are willing and able to buy. So let's look at each one of these determinants. The first determinant is a consumer's income. When we derived the demand curve initially, we held income constant. We derived a demand curve from indifference curves and budget lines. The budget line represented that constraint of your income. It was set, it did not change when we found the optimal consumption points and we found the demand curve. We held that budget constant. So here we're starting to change that income or budget that you have. So what happens to the demand curve? Well, it depends on whether you have a normal good or an inferior good. And in our previous videos, we defined each of these. So a normal good, when your income goes up, what happens? You want more. An inferior good, when your income goes up, that was the generics, the craft dinner, the public transportation. When your income went up, you want less. So we can look at this here on our graph. Let's look at a normal good. Okay, so restaurant meals. Let's say normally when you go out, you and your friends, you spend $100, and there's a certain number of times you go out to eat in a month. Okay, well, if your income goes up, what happens? Well, at $100 for you and your family or friends to eat, the amount of times that you're willing to go out is going to be higher. So notice that new point is not on the demand curve. We, in fact, have shifted the demand curve to the right. Demand has increased. So with a normal good, if your income goes up, demand increases. There's a shift to the right because at the current price, the quantity demanded is higher. If we have an inferior good, and I think we talked before about like craft dinner, mac and cheese, at $1 a box, right? There's a certain amount that you are willing and able to buy. Well, if your income increases, are you going to get more craft dinner? Well, if you think about it, when you're in college versus when you are established in your career, what's going to happen to the amount of craft dinner? Likely, you are going to switch to other things, fresh fruits and vegetables and gourmet meals. So at $1 a box, the amount you're willing and able to buy is less. Notice that point is not on the demand curve. We have in fact shifted the demand curve to the left. Demand has decreased. So if income goes up and you have an inferior good, demand will decrease. The graph will shift to the left. The second thing that will change demand is the price of related goods. And this brings us back to a conversation we had previously about perfect substitutes and perfect complements. So let's work through these. All right, so let's start with perfect complements. And what does it mean to be a complement? Well, complements are things that give you value when they are together. So we talked about hot dog and hot dog buns, or hamburger patties and hamburger buns, right? You only like them when they're together. Your truck, tires, right? You like the truck when it has tires. You can then take it places. Well, let's look at an example here of sugar and tea. So let's draw two graphs here. Here's demand, here's supply, and this will be our sugar market, and this will be our tea market. Okay. Okay, so suppose that there is something that disrupts supply in the sugar market. It's about 10 years ago or so, there was a big fire in Brazil that destroyed all these warehouses full of sugar. Well, what happens then is that at the current price of sugar, there is less available. So in that case, we have a point here, but it's not a change in consumer behavior, it's a change in the business, the producer. So what we have here is a decrease in supply. Okay, so let's assume there's a decrease in supply. There is now a shortage because here's the quantity that customers want. Here's the quantity that's available. Customers want more than there is because all the sugar caught on fire and is no more. That shortage drives up the price. So price of sugar goes up. If the price of sugar goes up, what happens in the market for tea? Well, if they are perfect complements, if you only like tea with sugar in it, and sugar is now more expensive, what happens to the amount of tea you are willing and able to buy? Well, if I can't have tea without sugar, and sugar costs more money, then I probably can't afford as much of the tea and sugar combination. So at the current price of tea, the amount that we're willing and able to buy, that quantity, okay, was here, is now here at a lower number. So there's less quantity that we are willing and able to buy at the current price. In this case, that change in the tea market is driven by the consumers. They're not willing to get as much because the sugar is more expensive. Notice this is a change in the price of sugar, not a change in the price of tea. So that decrease in demand for tea is going to mean that on the shelves, there is more tea available than customers want. There's a surplus of tea. What that's going to do in the tea market is, well, how do businesses get rid of it when they have too much? They get rid of it by putting it on sale. So what actually happens is when the price of sugar goes up, its complement, tea, the price of it, will go down. So notice how they're actually moving in opposite directions because we like them together. If one is now more expensive, we're going to demand less of the other, and that decrease in demand will drive down the price. So what is happening with the price of the complements will change demand. So it's the price of the related good, and they can be complements. We can also look at what happens with the price of substitutes. Okay. So let's draw that out. So let's suppose that we have perfect substitutes. What does it mean to be a substitute? Well, that means that to us, they give us similar utility or similar value. Okay, so let's look at coffee and tea. So let's suppose that you like them equally, or mostly equally, right? So they give you the same level of utility or happiness. All right, and let's draw our supply and demand for coffee. And as we look at coffee, it is getting more and more expensive to produce coffee, especially coffee that's made of Arabica beans. Because as we've seen climate change, droughts, flooding, extreme weather, this has impacted the crop of Arabica beans. And as those beans get more expensive, that impacts the ability to make, right? You're going to roast coffee. So what we have here is a change in supply because it is the business who's producing the coffee who's experiencing the change. And as it gets more expensive to produce coffee, if you want the producers to make the same quantity of coffee, they're going to have to charge more. So you can see that we're at a higher price for the same quantity. Notice we are not on the demand or supply curve. But it is a change to the business, so it is a change to supply. So in fact, supply decreases. So here we have supply decreases because the business isn't willing to produce as much at the same price. And if they're going to sell the same quantity, they're going to have to sell it at a higher price. So here we have this shift to the left, which is a decrease in supply. Well, what happens? At the current price, the quantity supply, the amount the businesses are able to produce, is less than the quantity demanded, the amount the customers want. Here we have a shortage. Customers want more than there is, so they're fighting each other for that coffee, and it's driving up the price. So the price of coffee goes up. Well, if coffee is now more expensive, what happens in the market for tea? Well, if we like coffee and tea equivalently, and coffee has gotten more expensive, what will happen? At the current price for tea, we are now willing and able to get more. Because all the times we would have had coffee instead, we're now going to get tea. So we have all the times we were going to get tea, plus all the times we were going to get coffee are now tea as well. So at the current price, the amount we are willing and able to buy is higher. Notice that point is not on the demand or supply curve. What have we done? We've changed consumer behavior, and so we have changed demand. Demand has increased. Well, if we're all switching from coffee to tea because tea is cheaper, what happens in the market for tea? Well, we now want more tea than businesses are making and selling, so we have a shortage, and that shortage is going to do what to the price of tea? It's going to make it go up. So notice here when we have substitutes, when the price of coffee went up, the price of tea went up. And that's because coffee got too expensive. We increased our demand for tea at the old tea price, but that drove up the price of tea because it creates a shortage. So whether you have complements or substitutes will change what happens to demand and the corresponding price. So it's important to know how goods are related and what is happening to the price of those related goods. Well, what happens to the demand for cell phones when the price of baseball bats increases? Well, unless you have a hobby where you take baseball bats and you break phones with your baseball bats, these two goods are not related. They are independent. The goods have to be related for the price of one to change the demand for another. So they need to be substitutes or complements So either give you the same utility or only give you utility when they're together in order for the price of one to change the demand for another. So we've looked at income. We've looked at the price of related goods. The third thing we want to look at is a change in taste or preference. So when we start to hear media reports about defective products, products giving you salmonella or having cadmium, or which is a toxic metal in them, or melamine, which is plastic being present in food, those types of things change your demand. So if we're to draw this here, here's demand, here's price and quantity. We'll add in supply, but we'll get to supply in later videos. So here, let's suppose that you're hearing all of these stories about how the product is bad for you or how it's tainted. Well, is that going to change the customer or the business? It's the customer, and your preference or how much you like something is what is changing. Remember, when we first created the demand curve, it was based on your preference and difference curves, marginal utility. But that was set. It wasn't changing. We represented it with a graph or with math, but it was fixed. Now what happens when those preferences, those tastes, change? Well, if you're hearing something is toxic or bad for you, then at the current price, you probably don't want the same quantity you had before. At the current price, less people are willing and able to buy. And if this is a market demand curve, it represents a collective group. So some people may still be willing to buy it, even though it may be toxic. Others, less so. They aren't buying at all. So collectively, the quantity we are willing and able to buy is less at the current price. What we've seen here is a decrease in demand, a shift to the left in the demand curve. What that means now is there's now more product available than customers want. How do businesses get rid of that excess? Well, they put it on sale. So we start at this price here, and we end up at a new equilibrium with a lower price because of that decrease in demand. You can go the other direction. So the must-have Christmas gift, telling you new reports that eggs are healthy for you or organic produce is better for you. Those types of things will cause us to be willing to buy more. So if this is the demand curve and supply curve before, what it does is it causes us to be willing and able to buy more at the current price, which is a shift in our demand curve to the right, and that's an increase in demand. Whereas the previous one, a shift to the left, is a decrease in demand. Okay, so income, price of related goods, tastes and preferences, and sometimes in this taste and preferences, we also include quality, because quality can change your preference. So if something is a better quality, then you tend to like it more, value it more, and that changes that marginal utility. So we can also include quality here. Okay. All right, so number 4 is expectations about future prices. So when we draw our demand and supply, this is current conditions, current price, current quantity sold. But our expectations about what will happen in the future will change our behavior. So for example, you're getting ready for the long weekend. What happens whenever there's a long weekend? What happens to gas prices? Well, gas prices always go up on the long weekend. Why is that? Well, the reason is that we expect gas prices to go up on the long weekend. So what do you do in the days before? You stock up. So if we expect the price to go up, we stock up. And if we stock up, then that means at the current price for gas, let's say it's $1 a liter, At the current price of gas at $1 a liter, the quantity that we are collectively willing and able to buy does what? Right? It's now a higher quantity. And we're no longer on that demand and supply curve. It's a change in behavior by consumers, so it's the demand curve, and it's a shift to the right. That means that now, in anticipation of the long weekend, we're draining all of the gas from the gas station. So what's the gas station going to do? Well, it's trying to keep up, okay? But as we are taking all the gas, it's temporarily creating a shortage because we want more than there is. And shortages drive up the price. And so what happens is the long weekend, the price goes up. So it's our expectation of higher prices that's a self-fulfilling prophecy that causes the higher prices that we see for the long weekend. Same thing if we're looking at purchasing a car, right? You're going to wait until they're doing 0% financing. And so if you expect there to be 0% financing in the future, what you're expecting is that the future price to you, right, because you include both the price of the car and the financing, will actually be cheaper. So that means your current demand, right, if we're all not going to go and buy cars now, we're all waiting, then what's currently happening is that at the current price, the quantity being sold is less. So if we are all anticipating a price to fall, then demand will decrease and it will actually drive the price down. All right, number 5. Number 5 is expectations of future income. So what are you expecting to have happen to your income? If you are expecting a pay raise, so have you ever heard that, okay, at the end of the month, you're getting a pay bump? What do you do right now? You haven't gotten that pay raise yet, but most of us, when we hear that we're getting our pay raise, we actually go out and at the current prices of things, we spend more. So our demand increases when we expect a raise. We could go the other way. If you're hearing how it's recession, how about bad economic conditions, that you might be laid off or get less hours, what do you tend to do? Well, you tend to spend less in anticipation that you're not going to have as much money in the future. So then demand decreases or shifts to the left. All right, one more shift in demand, which is the number of buyers or a change in the population. So when we look at supply and demand, here's demand, here's supply, here's price, here's quantity. That quantity sold is based on the amount of people who are willing and able to buy. And if you remember, we had an individual demand curve for one person, another individual demand curve for a second person. This market demand curve came from adding up the quantity demanded for each person at that same price. So we added up the quantity demanded at a specific price for everyone. That's how we get this market demand. So if you bring in more people who are now willing and able to buy, then you're going to have an increase in demand. So, for example, when college students like yourself come into Red Deer, then we now have more people looking for apartments to rent. And so at the current price, let's say it's $1,000 for an apartment, we now have more people who are willing and able to rent. That's an increase in demand because you'll notice that's a change in the consumer behavior. We're not on the demand curve. The price hasn't changed, but the amount the people are willing and able to buy has. So now there's more people who want to rent than space is available. So we have a shortage. Quantity demanded is more than quantity supplied. And that shortage drives up the rent. So the most expensive time during the year to find a new place to live tends to be in August and September, when college students come into town to look for a place for the year. The cheapest time to get an apartment to rent in Red Deer tends to be in May, June, when all of our college students graduate and their leases end and they move on. Because there, the demand is decreasing, and that puts downward pressure on the price. So when we look at our determinants of demand, we have changes in tastes and preferences. We have changes in the number of buyers. We have changes in the prices of related goods. And we have changes in expectations about future prices and future income. But notice that the price of the good is not one of them. It's a movement along the demand curve, whereas the things we've just gone through shift the demand curve to the right or the left.